Here come Roof Laptop, he come grooving up slowly. He's got juju eyeball.
Hello and welcome back. This video lecture is significant for a few reasons. Number one, it is the final video lecture on the 1960s, this portion of rock history which takes up 1/3 of the class. Today, we finished the 1960s. It also represents the halfway point of the semester. Now, this is Unit 3, and there are 7 units, but the amount of content in the first 3 units is equal to the amount of content in the next 4 units. Lastly, this video lecture is significant because of the video lecture's topic, the end of the Beatles breaking up as a band. Now, I am so tempted to go into what some people might describe as excruciating detail on this part of the Beatles' career. However, this has been a very long unit, so I am going to make every effort to be concise and only focus on the most important facts as they relate to the greater story of the Beatles' place in the history of rock. When we last left off, the Beatles had just released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, huge success, concept album, everyone loved it. Immediately after that, the Beatles released an EP. An EP is a shortened album. It's not the full long play, it's just a few songs. In this case, 6 songs, and the EP is titled Magical Mystery Tour. I mentioned very early on that the Beatles have 3 periods. The first period, it's everything from their love songs through the period where they were inspired by Bob Dylan to start writing more serious music. That's early Beatles. Then we get mid-Beatles, which is their experimental stage, when the Beatles are using the studio as an instrument. We have the Indian classical music, and we have the electronic music and the sampling. That's represented by Revolver, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and Magical Mystery Tour. The Beatles never released an album in which you could say the entire album was psychedelic. However, I think the most psychedelic sounding song the Beatles released is called I Am the Walrus, and that is on Magical Mystery Tour. Also, just look at the cover art or watch some of the music videos from Magical Mystery Tour. It's pretty trippy. It's certainly their most psychedelic phase. Around this time, the Beatles' manager, Brian Epstein, dies of a drug overdose. This leaves a management and power vacuum within the Beatles, and it marks the beginning of some significant troubles that the Beatles are really never going to recover from as a band. The next one to come out is called Yellow Submarine. Yellow Submarine is known for 2 songs in particular. The song Yellow Submarine, which is sung by Ringo Starr, and All You Need Is Love, which has really turned into one of John Lennon's most iconic songs. Well, after Yellow Submarine, which really marks the end of the Beatles' psychedelic period, that's when we get into the Beatles' final 3 albums. The first of these last 3 is actually just called Beatles, not even The Beatles, just Beatles. The album cover is solid white, there's no picture, there's no print, there's just the word Beatles embossed on the album cover, so you can't even really see it unless you hold it at a certain angle and it casts a very subtle shadow on the embossed part. Because the cover is solid white, it's come to be known as the White Album. From this point on, I will refer to it as the White Album, but just remember, its official name is Beatles. The White Album is a double album, meaning there are actually 2 12-inch vinyl discs, both with music on the front and back, which makes it twice as long as a normal record. I want to guide you through some of the most important songs. The opening track is called Back in the USSR, and this song pays homage to the Beach Boys with a high beach falsetto-style harmony and boogie-woogie bass line. As I mentioned, the Beatles were starting to have problems within the band, and those problems start to show up on this album. One in particular is that there was a brief period in which Ringo left the group and they were without a drummer. Paul McCartney just played drums. So when you listen to Back in the USSR, that's Paul singing, playing bass, and playing the drum set. We also have the songs Dear Prudence, Obla Di Obla Da, the continuing story of Bungalow Bill, which is important. It's not one of their hits by any means, but it's important because Yoko Ono sings on this. Remember, Yoko Ono is this woman that John Lennon has started dating. He's bringing his new girlfriend into the recording studio and actually having her sing on songs. Now, it's not that the other Beatles are mad at him, so to speak. They're happy. They can see that he's in love. He recognized that Yoko Ono was a good fit for him, but they were still just a little irritated that she was singing on records. It's not that no one else other than the Beatles had ever performed on a Beatles record before. On She's Leaving Home, they brought in a professional harpist. For Eleanor Rigby, they brought in a professional string section. For A Day in the Life, they brought in a full orchestra. For Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, they brought in 4 French horns. It's not that they don't use studio musicians when they need that instrument, but she was brought in because of her relationship with John, and she's one of only 2 people to be brought on and perform on a Beatles record other than the Beatles, if you don't count professional studio musicians. The second person to do that actually performs on the next song, While My Guitar Gently Weeps by George Harrison with guest star Eric Clapton of the Yardbirds and Cream. We also have Happiness is a Warm Gun, Blackbird, which is Paul McCartney's commentary on the civil rights movement in America in the 1960s. The song Why Don't We Do It in the Road, which is another example of these problems within the band. So John and George were busy with another part of the album. So Paul writes this song called Why Don't We Do It in the Road, and he and Ringo record this song by themselves without even telling John or George. By the time John and George are done, Paul and Ringo say, hey, we have another song for the album. And that's actually representative of the album at large. Previous albums have always featured a lot of collaboration between the band members, and this one is what the textbook author calls a songwriters collective. It's almost like 4 people working individually a lot of the time, rather than 4 men working together. The song Julia, which is by John Lennon about his mother. As you move to the second disc, you get the song Birthday, and the #1 song associated with birthdays is the song Happy Birthday to You. But I bet you've probably heard the Beatles' birthday song as well. If you've ever been to an Applebee's or a Chili's, the servers have probably sang this version of Birthday. Track 6 on the second album is called Helter Skelter. Now, Helter Skelter is really significant because music scholars and musicologists often cite Helter Skelter as being the first heavy metal song ever. Now, no one is saying the Beatles are a heavy metal band. Everyone generally agrees that Black Sabbath are the first heavy metal band with maybe a little bit of competition from Led Zeppelin. And no one's using the term heavy metal. Heavy metal was first used in the Steppenwolf song Born to Be Wild. But in terms of musical characteristic and quality, I think you can definitely hear why many music scholars suggest that this is the first heavy metal song. It just has this really heavy, distorted guitar, thrashing drums, wild screaming vocals, squealing electric guitar. This song was actually the result of a bet, sort of a friendly wager between Paul McCartney and Pete Townshend of The Who to see who could write a heavier song. And Paul McCartney, while he was friends with Pete Townshend, he was really disappointed because he thought Pete was going to come up with something incredible and blow Paul away, and it turns out Helter Skelter is significantly heavier than what Pete came up with. And on the B side of the second album, there are 2 songs with a similar name, Revolution 1 and Revolution 9. Revolution 1 is by John Lennon, and it's his commentary on Mao Zedong, the leader of the totalitarian communist regime in China, responsible for numerous atrocities, including the murder of 50 million Chinese citizens. The song Revolution 9 is very different. Revolution 9 is more of an experimental song in the style of Karlheinz Stockhausen. The reason it's called Revolution 9, well, there are 2. #1 is they actually sample many different sounds, including part of Revolution 1. You can hear little bits of it in the background, but also someone is narrating number 9 over the song. This song is as experimental as the Beatles get. Okay, well, at this point we have 2 albums left, Abbey Road from 1969 and Let It Be from 1970. And I've gone in order up to this point, so I should talk about Abbey Road first and then talk about Let It Be, right? Well, that's not what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about Let It Be first because Let It Be was actually written and recorded before Abbey Road. So Let It Be was written in January of 1969, with the exception of the song Across the Universe, which was written in February of 1968. Abbey Road was written between February and August of 1969, so as soon as they finished Let It Be, they went right into Abbey Road, but Abbey Road was then released in September of 1969, so just 1 month of post-production. They finished recording, they took another month to add some effects, edit, adjust things and levels the way they wanted it, and then they released the album. Well, Abbey Road took 1 month, but Let It Be took 16 months. 16 months of post-production. So why did it take so long? Well, Let It Be is the only Beatles album that wasn't produced by George Martin. They wanted to go a different direction on this one, and if you're the Beatles, the biggest band in the world, and it's the 1960s, and you can work with any producer you want to work with, who are you going to choose? You're going to choose Phil Spector. The man, the myth, the legend. That's who you're going to go with, and that's who the Beatles go with. So Let It Be is produced by Phil Spector, and he adds so many extra musical elements. Musical elements is the way I have to describe it if I want to use the appropriate musical nomenclature. But if I'm speaking plainly, he adds a lot of stuff, a lot of extra fluff and stuff, and there's just all this extraness. That's the lay definition. I just can't believe that they finished the album in January of 1969, and in between the time that Phil Spector starts doing his magic, starts working his magic, and when the album is released, the Beatles are able to write, record, and release another album, and still have 8 months to spare. So we're talking about Let It Be first. Let's discuss the songs. As before, just focusing on some of the biggest hits from the album, Across the Universe by John Lennon, the song Let It Be. The opening lyrics of Let It Be are, "When I find myself in times of trouble, Mother Mary comes to me, speaking words of wisdom, let it be, let it be." A lot of people think that the song is referring to the Virgin Mary because he says Mother Mary. That's not true. He's referring to Mary McCartney, his actual mother. The song Let It Be on the album Let It Be is just one more example of the problems within the Beatles. John Lennon suggests that that was completely a Paul song, that he didn't really invite collaboration or input from the rest of the band, that Paul should have just saved that for his solo career. And all the Beatles have been accused of that behavior on various songs. This is just one of the biggest examples. On the B side of Let It Be, we also have songs like The Long and Winding Road and Get Back. Now, this song is released in May of 1970. The Beatles broke up in April of 1970, so by the time fans are hearing this, the Beatles have already been broken up for a month. This may not be the last album they wrote, but it is the last album they released, and it's the last impression that the fans received. So I think it's really fitting that this song, The Long and Winding Road, is on the final side of the last album the Beatles released, because it expresses the Beatles' prolific career and how bittersweet this moment is. Of course, everyone's really sad that the Beatles are breaking up, but at the same time, they're approaching 30, their lives are changing, and they want to make their own music at this point. So they get to close the chapter of the Beatles and they get to move forward and write new, exciting music on their own. Like I mentioned, lots of fluff, lots of stuff added by Phil Spector. Paul McCartney didn't love it. None of the Beatles really did. Like, they thought it was great, but that's not how they would have done it. And the thing with George Martin is George Martin really understood how they wrote music, and they almost had this shared language in talking about music and figuring out what was appropriate for the song. So 6 years after this album comes out, Paul McCartney decides that he thinks he might want to go back in and release the album the way the Beatles originally envisioned it. This is a very long project, but finally in 2003, Paul McCartney finishes and he releases an album on behalf of the Beatles called Let It Be... Naked. It's the same album, the same performances by all the Beatles. The difference is all of Phil Spector's contributions have been removed. So if you like Phil Spector's stuff, listen to the original Let It Be. If you want to hear the Beatles' original vision for it, listen to Let It Be Naked. Before we move on to the final album recorded by the Beatles, Abbey Road, I want to talk about one of the Beatles' most popular songs, Hey Jude. John Lennon has fallen in love with Yoko Ono, but he's in the process of going through this divorce from his wife, Cynthia. And I also mentioned John Lennon and Cynthia's son, Julian, who everyone calls Jude. He was 5 years old during Sgt. Pepper when he drew that picture, which he titled Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Well, now we're in 1968. Jude is 6 years old at this point, and he's really struggling with his parents' divorce. It's hitting him hard, as it would any 6-year-old. So Paul McCartney tries to help Jude in the best way he can as a songwriter, so he writes a song for Jude. The song is called Hey Jude, and it's just for him, just Paul saying, I'm here for you, you're going to be okay, I know this is hard, I know this is horrible, but you're going to get through this, and I'm here for you. Hey Jude, don't make it bad, sing a sad song and make it better. So he sings it for him, but then everyone around who's listening to it says, Paul, that was one of the greatest songs you've ever written. We have to record this. And Paul says, no, this isn't a song for a record. This was just for Jude. And they say, but Paul, this is one of the greatest songs you've ever written. We have to record this. So Paul goes up to 6-year-old Jude and he says, would it be okay if I share your song with the world? So that's how Hey Jude came to be. It was released as a single. It wasn't on any of their albums. And a lot of Beatles songs are like that. I Want to Hold Your Hand was never released on an album. Paperback Writer wasn't released on an album. Don't Let Me Down wasn't released on an album. We don't really see that today, but that's how it was working with the Beatles, because Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band really established the album as the standard way that rock bands record and release music, that it's about this complete set. Before that, it was normal practice to release singles. Practically all of Elvis's music was released as singles. So in the Beatles' career, because the Beatles are the ones who transform and are responsible for this shift, they're still doing a little bit of both. They're releasing these albums that are a complete musical work, but they're also releasing singles along the way. Okay, this is it. Abbey Road, 1969, the last album the Beatles record. They go back to their original producer, George Martin, for this one. So talking through the songs on here, we have Come Together, one of the Beatles' biggest hits by John Lennon. Something by George Harrison. Now, the Beatles were working with a man by the name of James Taylor. We're going to talk about James Taylor more in the next video lecture, but James Taylor wrote a song called Something in the Way She Moves, and George Harrison heard this and loved it, and he went up to him and said, James, do you mind if I use that lyric and I write a new song around that? And James Taylor, their friend, says, of course, absolutely. So the song Something by the Beatles and Something in the Way She Moves by James Taylor open with the same lyrics. It's intentional, it was allowed, it was a gift and exchange between friends. Oh Darling, which is really reminiscent of late 1950s, early 1960s rock pop. I Want You, She's So Heavy. It's one song with sort of two distinct parts to it. And I've mentioned some examples of the troubles within the Beatles at this point. Well, there's one meeting they're having in London on this sort of gray, cloudy, miserable day, and everyone's going at each other, and the band and the production team, and they just can't seem to come to agreement. And George Harrison is just over it. He can't deal with it anymore, so he walks outside. It's this ugly day, and it seems to be so representative of how he's feeling inside. So he just goes and sits in the grass and asks himself, are we going to get through this? Are we even going to finish this last album? Well, as soon as he's thinking that, and as soon as he's looking at this miserable day, the clouds clear, and he says to himself, here comes the sun. George takes this as the sign that we're going to get through this. Things are bad now, but we're going to get through this. So in that moment, George Harrison sits and writes the song, Here Comes the Sun. We also have Because with this amazing a cappella vocal harmony. And the final song I want to draw your attention to is one of what I like to think of as two final gifts the Beatles gave us, because at this point they know they're going to break up. They know they can't deal with it anymore. They're just over it at this point. They've been nonstop for more than 10 years, and they want to close this chapter of their lives. But rather than just abruptly stopping, not only do they give us this last album, but the final song on the album is called The End. And I think it's the perfect finale for the Beatles' music. Don't forget, Let It Be was released after this, but this is their final time in the studio. This is the last song they write as a band. Has one of the best drum solos of any rock song, and most of the song is just this classic rock jam. Everyone's playing their original instruments that they played way back on their first records. There's hardly any singing, but when the singing does come in at the very end, it's just the lyrics. And in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make. A profound and fitting end to the Beatles' career. But I mentioned there are two things the Beatles did that I look at as gifts to the fans, acknowledging that none of this would have been possible without the fans. The second gift is called the Rooftop Concert. So this takes place on top of their recording studio on January 30th, 1969 in London. Remember, the Beatles retired from performing in the summer of 1966, so it's been 2.5 years since they've played together. They play in the studio, but they haven't performed a concert live in front of anyone in 2.5 years. It's an incredible performance. It's the final performance. Even though they thought they'd never perform together again, they give us one last concert. They don't announce it. They just take their equipment up to the roof and they start playing. And all the local residents know that that's the Beatles recording studio, and they hear the Beatles, and sure enough, they look up and see them on the roof. They only play for about a half hour, maybe a little longer. But people start calling all their friends, and by the end of this concert, this area of London is just swarming with people. Everyone comes to see the Beatles because they never thought they would hear them again. Well, you already know the ending of this chapter in rock history. The Beatles do break up in April of 1970. I'd like to close this lecture and close this long unit on the 1960s and close the first half of this class by taking just another minute of your time to address why the Beatles were so important to the history of rock and why we've spent so much time talking about them up to this point. The Beatles were the first self-contained band. They developed this blueprint for every band that would come after them. It's 4 musicians, guitar, bass, vocal drums, everyone sings, everyone plays. They write their own music, they record their own music, they go on tour and perform their own music. All 4 of them are amazing songwriters and virtuoso performers. In 1963 and 1966, the Beatles proved that UK music could be just as good, if not better, than US music. They had instant success on The Ed Sullivan Show on February 9th, 1964. They inspired millions of people, especially young people, to pick up instruments, which we can see from the many garage bands that popped up around the country following the Beatles' music. The Beatles played the first rock stadium show at Shea Stadium, where the Mets play in Queens, New York in 1965. We, of course, have Beatlemania, tens of thousands of people following, chasing, and screaming after the Beatles. Just like the teen idols of the early 1960s, the Beatles were also in movies playing themselves as well as other characters. The Beatles are one of the first bands to really tap into merchandising. You can buy a Yellow Submarine lunchbox. You can buy a Ringo Starr bobblehead. The Beatles had these distinct phases in terms of their appearance. They started with the leather jackets and the slick back hair, and then they evolved into this more refined look with the suits and the mop tops. Then we see the Sgt. Pepper's phase with the shaggy short hair and the mustaches. And finally, we have the hippie phase of the White Album, Abbey Road, and Let It Be. In addition to their appearance, we also have three distinct musical periods. The early period where they focused on these love songs and the more serious music inspired by Bob Dylan. Then we have this middle period that's very experimental and psychedelic, followed by their late period where they return to their roots and really establish the style that will go on to be known as classic rock. So tying in with this prefix proto that we discussed in Unit 1, we could say that the Beatles' late period is proto-classic rock. The Beatles are the first, last, only band to ever have the top 5 spots simultaneously on the Billboard Hot 100 chart. Over the course of 8 years, the Beatles recorded 213 songs. Of Rolling Stone's 3 greatest albums of all time, 2 of them are by the Beatles. Number 3 is Revolver by the Beatles. Number 2 is Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys, and number 1 is Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band by the Beatles. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, while we're on this topic, is recognized as the first major concept album. That's not only important because other bands start writing music around one concept, but just the fact that, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, before the Beatles, most music was just released as singles. Like I said, that's what Elvis did. But after the Beatles, it becomes more about the album, and you have to write this complete work. That model of bands and solo artists being expected to release this entire album starts in the mid-60s and lasts all the way through the early to mid-2000s. The Beatles pioneered using the studio as an instrument. Rolling Stone calls the Beatles the greatest band of all time. Rolling Stone calls Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band the greatest album of all time. Now, you could argue that those are subjective decisions, but one fact is that Yesterday is the most played song of all time. The Beatles, in part at least, were responsible for turning rock and roll into a serious art form. I mean, look at this right now. This is a college class, and college students are studying rock music. We have to give the Beatles a lot of credit for that shift in public perception of rock music. They established this standard of releasing 12 albums. As I mentioned earlier, many famous artists, Billy Joel is one of them, stopped recording albums after their 12th. They said, if the Beatles only released 12, who am I to release a 13th? I'll still perform, I'll still tour, I'll still play music, but I'm not going to try to do more than the Beatles. You see the same thing in classical music. Beethoven wrote 9 symphonies. Most composers won't write more than 9 symphonies because the thought process there is, who am I to try to do more than Beethoven? Who am I to try to do more than the Beatles? All 4 Beatles have been knighted by Queen Elizabeth II, Queen of England, Sir Paul McCartney, Sir John Lennon, Sir George Harrison, and Sir Ringo Starr. And the final point is that the Beatles have been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the greatest honor in rock music. Well, of course they have. That shouldn't surprise anyone. But what's unique and very special about the Beatles is they're the only band that has not only been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but every member of the band has also been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame individually. They're the only band that that's true for. Paul McCartney is in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a solo artist. John Lennon, George Harrison, Ringo Starr, all 4 of them have been recognized for their individual contributions as well as their contributions as a band. Well, that's it. Congratulations. You've made it through the 60s, you've made it through the Beatles, and you've made it through the first half of this class. Next time, we'll get into the 1970s.